Now that we've talked about what macros are and how to define them, how to use them, let's talk about how your scheme interpreter would need to change in order to support macros. In fact, there's an optional question on Project 4 about macros. So if you finished Project 4 and you're looking for something else to do to extend your interpreter, here's a good thing to add because it doesn't take a lot of code, but teaches you exactly how macros work. And there's really two parts to solving this. One is to implement how the define macro special form works. That's actually the easy part. It's almost like defining a procedure. The slightly more involved part happens when you have a call expression where the operator, the first expression, evaluates to a macro. A call to a macro has a different evaluation procedure than a call to a regular procedure. So if you look here, it says implement define macro by implementing doDefine macro. Well, what is that about? Well, remember, scheme eval checks to see if the first symbol is in the special forms. Define macro is one of the special forms, and so it's going to call the doDefine macro function in your scheme interpreter. And what that's going to do is create a new macro, just like you would create a new Lambda procedure, and it will bind it to the name that's given in the definition expression. The interesting part about macros is really what happens when you call them. What happens when you use a macro is you write a call expression where the operator evaluates to some macro. So for example, the symbol for is bound to a macro procedure in the example that we just did. So here we get to the else case where we try to evaluate a call expression. We evaluate the first expression in that list of expressions that forms the call expression. Maybe it's the symbol for. When that gets evaluated, you get a macro. Well, that's a special case. Normally what you do in a call expression is you'd evaluate all the operands next and then call the procedure on the arguments that are the values of the operands. But macros are different. Instead, you apply the macro to the expressions that are in the call expression before you evaluate them. Those expressions might be symbols, they might be lists, anything is fine, but they are pieces of scheme code which serve as the arguments to the macro. The macro then returns something which is a scheme expression, and that has to get evaluated too. So instead of the usual pattern of evaluate the operator, evaluate the operands, call the procedure on the arguments, instead you get evaluate the operator, apply it to the operands to get back an expression that you evaluate. And you can write all of that in terms of scheme apply and scheme eval, just like you would with regular procedures, but the particular order that things happen in is a little bit different. And that's what it would take to implement macros in your scheme interpreter.